Good evening and welcome to Forum Focus. Tonight's focus, the developing situation in Iran and Israel as tensions continue to rise around the world, from the Middle East to growing concerns about border security, terrorism, and geopolitical instability. The role of Homeland Security has never been more important. Governments are facing complex threats that range from traditional national security challenges to cyber attacks and international crime, all while trying to keep citizens safe in an increasingly unpredictable global environment. And joining us now to help understand what these development means from a security perspective, I'm joined by Charles Marino, former senior law enforcement advisor at the Department of Homeland Security. Thanks so much for joining us.
Wyatt, good to be back with you again.
Thank you so much. Let's just perhaps start out with how you would describe kind of the current moment, politically speaking, that Iran is in right now.
Well, look, it's obviously a very precarious situation for Iran to be in right now. If you go back in history and look at why we're dealing with Iran the way it is today, you have to go back to the vacuum that they filled following the war against Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein, and then later the removal of Gaddafi in Libya. This created a vacuum that Iran stepped up and filled in the Middle East. And so as a result, they became a much more powerful adversary for the United States than they had historically been prior to those two moments. And so as a result, here we are today. And this is now, the culmination of 45 years of dealing off and on with Iran as a country, and it needed to be dealt with once they started to not walk away and refuse to walk away from their nuclear ambitions. It was in fact time for both the United States and Israel and other allies in the Middle East to step up and solve the problem.
And President Trump was asked this in the White House by Caitlin Collins just a few days ago about kind of the motives behind this. I mean, you mentioned certainly as well kind of the nuclear ambitions that Iran has, and the fact that that was one of the reasons why this happened, wanting to kind of quell those ambitions. And Caitlin Collins' question to the president was about what the administration did in June when they bombed the enrichment sites there in Iran, and questioning why this in particular was necessary after that happened. What would be your response to that as someone who's very knowledgeable on the topic?
Well, there was no change in regime. And because there was no change in regime after that initial attack on the nuclear sites, it meant that the strategy wasn't going to change and that Iran was, in fact, going to continue to aggressively seek nuclear materials in the effort to build nuclear weapons. Of course, we know that just being a threat in itself by Iran possessing this capability, it would also create a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East, something that the United States and other countries definitely did not want to see happen. So we needed a change in regime in Iran. And I think it's also something that the people of Iran were waiting for.
And just quickly here, about a minute or so left. What do you think people from outside the region, specifically in the United States, need to understand about what's happening there? Because I think what's been kind of taking place in the media landscape in the United States recently, in particular, has been people making their argument based off of the domestic politics and not really incorporating the elements of kind of what's actually happening there on the ground. Maybe speak a little bit about that.
Well, it doesn't apply to just the United States. It applies to
Hmm.
Canada, it applies to every other country. These global events and positions uh, have impacts on our domestic front here at home. And so, as you see an evolution and continuing development of these types of weapons out of Iran, you're going to see potential repercussions here at home. And so, you've got to keep your own national security in mind as a country in terms of confronting these types of actions. Some argue that this is an isolationism in terms of our strategy. It's not. I think we were using a
Mhm.
strategy of containment, and that containment was no longer enough.
Welcome back. We are continuing the conversation on the state of affairs in Iran right now, of course, as the United States and Israel ended up killing the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, just a few days ago. And joining me now to talk about it is former Homeland Security official Charles Marino. Thanks so much for being back with us.
Good to be back.
When you look kind of at the trajectory in particular of the country over the past few years, what kind of stands out most to you with respect to how power itself actually gets formed in Iran, and then how people and how kind of the regime coerces the people in Iran to be in support of the regime?
Well, they rule by fear and intimidation, and that's how they achieve their goals. There's no checks and balances from the 92 million uh, citizens that live in Iran. So this is not a government by the people and for the people. This is a government run based on what they believe the public needs. And again, it follows very strict culture and is not as Western leaning as I think the general population wants it to be.
And in terms of kind of what's been happening and the leaders who have been speaking out either in support or against what's happened there, people in Canada have been noting what Prime Minister Mark Carney has done. He originally issued a statement where he said that he was in support of the actions of the United States and Israel. But I think a lot of the political pressure from the political left in Canada in particular has made him and kind of his advisors and those around him pull back on their support of President Trump and his actions with respect to the killing of Ali Khamenei. I'm wondering, kind of from your perspective, what you expect as it relates to other world leaders, other members of the G7. You have the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer as well, and how they might respond and either be in support or against what the United States is doing.
Yeah, publicly, I don't think you're going to see too much of a split. I think the consensus is that Iran was a problem that
Hmm.
finally had to be dealt with. So while some leaders are going to have to adjust their messaging based on their populations and navigate those politics locally, I think in general, each of these leaders would tell you that they're finally happy to see this threat be confronted because this threat wasn't going anywhere. It was never going to go away. And look, we can see this based on not only the symmetrical response by Iran to the military attacks of the
Hmm.
United States and Israel against their neighbors, but we can also see it in the asymmetrical threats that they have represented for decades, not only to the region, but to the globe. We're talking about Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and other. So they didn't always play fair with their own neighbors. So what made us think they were going to play fair with us
Yeah.
or any other countries?
And I mentioned in the introduction there, of course, that you served at the Department of Homeland Security. And I think one of the concerns that people have is that Iran now, despite the fact that their supreme leader is gone, they just announced yesterday that they are appointing a new one, of course, the son of the preceding one. But I guess I'm kind of curious because there's a lot of concern that some of these proxy groups like Hezbollah and other ones might start to, plant attacks on the U.S. homeland. Is that a concern that someone like yourself has, again, with the extent and with the level of knowledge that you have within the department itself?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a concern I have. It's a concern that's shared by US law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And it's a concern that's shared by those entities within other countries
Hmm.
as well. Look, this is the type of asymmetrical response that we would expect from Iran. And unfortunately, as we learned here in the United States under the previous administration, under President Biden, uh, a lack of border security and immigration enforcement comes with consequences, and that is global threats are allowed to enter freely into the country. And when you have a global incident or war between us and a country like Iran, you now have these threats that have already made their way into the country and can be activated at a moment's notice. And I think we're going to see this theme play out, which is why other countries are also concerned on their own domestic fronts about these potential retaliatory actions because
Hmm.
they have also ceded their own border and immigration policies. And this
Right.
will serve as the Achilles heel.
Welcome back to Forum Focus. Again, I'm joined by Charles Marino, former Homeland Security official. Charles, one of the things that I'm kind of have been talking about and that I've been kind of getting a sense of is, of course, that the access to information in Iran is very limited. And it creates for a world where people in the United States, I don't think, really clue into this because of how accessible, how easy it is, again, in Canada, for us to go on social media and post our own political opinions and positions. Whereas in Iran, that's something that does not happen. And so, from your perspective, how much more difficult does that make it to lead kind of a revolution, if you will, against this type of a regime?
Well, I don't think one can argue that the intelligence so far between the United States and Israel when it comes to Iran has been superb.
Hmm.
You just have to look at the leadership degradation that took place in the initial days of this war. And I think you will see very clearly that information was flowing in exactly the manner to exactly where it needed to go to facilitate these attacks. Initially, we're also talking about the ability to target and identify hardware to prevent further attacks. Where now there's airspace supremacy immediately over the country. So intelligence as this goes on, I think will continue to be superb, although the targets become harder to identify because they become fewer and fewer. Here we see the Ayatollah's son has been named as the next Ayatollah. Obviously, we're going to look to knock that out as quickly as possible because what'll happen is you won't see what your options really are from the next wave of
Hmm.
leadership until that next wave of potential leadership feels comfortable that they're not jeopardizing their own lives. And I think the United States would say the same thing that they don't want to see those options present themselves until we have finished the job with removing the entirety of the remaining threat from the IRGC.
And one thing you mentioned there, it kind of made me think with respect to, in order for regime change to actually be meaningful, there needs to be someone who champions the values of democracy and of kind of a democratic future. And to your point, obviously, Ali Khamenei's son is not someone who does that. And so I wonder what role the United States, from your perspective, plays in that level of regime change to ensure that some of those principles can be guaranteed.
Yeah, I think it's got to be seeing this mission through and totally taking out any persons that have allegiance to the Ayatollah and the previous regime. Obviously, right now, that's not good with his son stepping up. But I'll tell you, I can't find a person in the world that would want the job
Hmm.
that he has right now because he is being hunted as we speak, and these strikes will continue
Yeah.
as time goes on. I do not see this as an extraordinarily long campaign. I see this as a an intelligence driven war that is going to achieve the means that allow for what you and I were just talking about, and that is a change in leadership.
And in about a minute or so, but what are some of the internal power struggles that will limit the ability or limit the potentiality for the US to assist in that regime change to have a leader in Iran who actually does care about some of the same principles that the US does?
Yeah. Well, I think on the religious front, it's not going to play as significant a role once you get rid of that pre-existing
Hmm.
leadership structure in Iran. While it certainly will play a role, look, that can enter the democratic process once it's in place in Iran and be worked out amongst the political parties, for example.
Right.
That may come to fruition as a result. So, I think what we are looking under the previous regime is a very stringent, antiquated form of government. Like I said earlier, that was not democratic in any means in the way that it ruled. And I think it outlived its usefulness in that country.
Right. Welcome back. Again, we are discussing the state of affairs in Iran after Israel and the US led an operation that killed the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, and now his son is the new Ayatollah. And joining me now to continue the conversation once again is Charles Marino, former official at the Department of Homeland Security. Let's just kind of conclude our conversation by talking about where things will go from here. And we've been talking a little bit about this, but in terms of what
Mhm.
actually happens in the country of Iran. We were talking about power a little bit. We were talking about kind of decision making and accessibility for people to kind of make their voices heard there. But from your perspective, how do some of these decisions actually get formed, and how might that change now that the Ali Khamenei's son is the one who is in charge?
Well, I think the outcomes are always going to be viewed from the perspective of the countries that have taken action, and that's the United States and
Hmm.
Israel right now, and some of our allies in the Middle East. And first and foremost, they're going to put as a priority their own national security. Their own survival, their own protection. And I think that's the way it needs to be. I think Iran has rightfully been designated as a clear and present danger to all of those involved in this war right now. And so action needed to be taken. So going forth, it is how do you achieve the results that you want to see where Iran no longer represents the threats, including their goals of becoming a nuclear Iran, and getting that in a good place where for time going forward, we have now removed the threat uh, globally.
And I wonder how concerned you are, because the White House, even just a few days ago, said that they can't essentially rule out that there might need to be people on the ground in Iran, troops on the ground in Iran. And I wonder how concerned you are if it does escalate to that, which obviously it would need to get quite serious in order for that to happen, what the threat or what the
Mhm.
impact might be for Americans at home. And then going back to even what we talked about earlier with respect to some of these proxy groups and their presence on the US homeland as well. What might that mean in terms of, again, the impact that it can have on the American people?
Yeah. Well, from the US perspective, and this is true for any world leader, you would hope that the toughest decision is deciding when to send men and women to war. And I know that this president takes great care in thinking through this, minimizing risk to the greatest extent possible. The United States has already lost seven service members in this war, with a lot others that have been injured. And so you go into these conflicts with a mind on making it as safe as you possibly can during a time of war, but wanting to still achieve the goals to ensure our own national security. So this is not an easy decision. It's not an easy decision for Israel, I'm sure, just like it wouldn't be an easy decision for Canada to do this. So, I think going forward, I expect again to see an intelligence driven war using land and air and sea power. But as far as full on boots on the ground, I don't anticipate that we will see that anytime soon.
And you mentioned the power of the intelligence in Israel and certainly the power of American intelligence. That's very powerful as well. And then when you put the two together, extremely powerful. But when you look to Iran and the fact that there's speculation that they have the support of Russia, the Iranian foreign minister wouldn't fully say whether or not that was the case. But it almost becomes an intelligence war. So maybe speak a little bit about the dynamics that shape that.
Well, it does. And let's remember what's also at risk here for countries like China and Russia and North Korea.
Hmm.
There on the table, there is a loss of a significant ally for them. Yes, Russia is bogged down with Ukraine. So, from a military perspective, really way too stretched thin to be of any consequence in this
Right.
war. We don't see China playing a significant role, but we know that they will help in ways
Hmm.
to the detriment of the United States, and that is through sharing intelligence.
All right. We will leave it there. Charles Marino, thank you so much.
Thanks, Wyatt. Great to see you.
All right, that's going to do it for Forum Focus tonight. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.